the word for love here is mahal, which is to love, just mahal. But mahal is also the same word we use for something that's expensive. In other words, something that's valuable. So mahal could mean both love and value.
Welcome to Intrigue. I'm your host, Joshua Crook, and today I'm joined by Carl Lorenz Cervantes, who is a lecturer, a psychologist, and a researcher in the Philippines who looks at folk psychology and spirituality and some of the lessons we can draw from them. For the purposes of this, do you want to give you a brief introduction?
Yeah. Well, first, thanks for inviting me to talk. It's always nice to meet to meet peers in the larger field around the world. So it's nice to have these conversations. I do live for these conversations. I like talking to different people and then finding a lot of these intersections of how people think. The work that I do is, you might categorize it as indigenous psychology. And indigenous here just means that it comes from a particular culture. So not necessarily that it's native to a land or that it's that it only emerges in a geographical space, but indigenous in the sense that it's what naturally occurs in a culture. I'm not trying to define what a Filipino is. That's something that people do have a misconception about the work that I do. I'm not trying to define anything. But I am saying that, this is what is happening. This is the stuff that's coming up in the culture that we have. These are the concepts that have been misinterpreted because we do have a colonial history. These are the concepts that are mistranslated, maybe taken out of context. And we're just trying to go back to this intuitive space. So that's the work that I do. I actually started with the paranormal. So my interest has always been in the paranormal. My research, my graduate research was in telepathy, of all things. But it's from that research that I realized and that I saw more studies and more experiences connecting it to Filipino psychology, connecting it to the Filipino experience. And the more we actually pay attention, the more we see that Filipino culture is highly what others might term as paranormal is just really normal to us. It's just an aspect of culture. So I found that really interesting. That got me into studying more on the spiritual, mystical aspects of our culture, and eventually into the heritage of language, eventually into what people call decolonization. I find it to be a clunky academic term, but it really is just going back to your roots, really just authenticity. Really just going back to intuition.
You seem to have a kind of a broader view of psychology than the traditional academics. Is there something particular that led you to that broader perspective?
Well, psychology to me has always been just self-understanding. So I entered into the field more than a decade ago just as a way to explore myself, really, just to understand how people think, how people act, because I like people. I genuinely just enjoy exploring these things. And then when I realized and when I saw that there's been research in mythology and magic within the field of psychology, especially with depth psychology, Jungian psychology, this got me even more interested because that was my childhood interest. Magic, mythology, spirituality, a lot of these myths and folk tales. Because growing up, there's always been a lot of these folk beliefs lived out. We always had, a lot of strange experiences. I talk about these in other podcasts, actually, when people invite me to talk about more paranormal stuff. I grew up with wherein this kind of thing was normal. It was part of our experience to have, a lot of these strange things. And as I grew up, going into the academe and going into the field of psychology, seeing that this was something that I can study, like that's something that I can actually look into in a systematic way, not just in a materialist way, but more in a phenomenological, like meaning-based way, then that's what got me really, really interested.
It begins with some of your discussions about the self and the individual, and grows out of that, it seems. How does that relate to your psychological research?
Well, the thing is, indigenous psychology, at least Filipino indigenous psychology, because there's so many indigenous psychologies around the world. A lot of them grew from the 70s as a way to question the dominance of Western psychology, or what we now call weird psychology, right? Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. But the work that I do, the way that I see it really, is more of an exploring of a field that hasn't been really landmarked very well. So I'm just in some way, in a mythic way, I'm like a map maker, just trying to map out the landscape of this place. So really a huge part of it is deeply spiritual. So I don't see much of a distinction between what we consider to be psychological and what we consider to be spiritual. Maybe a word that could be a little more academic to use is transpersonal. So it just goes beyond the person, right? I'm not saying that Filipino psychology is like a cultural subset of the larger field of what we call transpersonal psychology, which is a Western field anyway, but it is in a lot of ways transpersonal as an adjective, meaning it goes beyond the person. Concepts such as kapwa, which is considered to be the core concept of Filipino psychology, is an interpersonal, expansive aspect of self. It's close to the African concept of Ubuntu, which is I am because we are, but kapwa is a shared identity. And even scholars today, such as Catherine de Guia, whose interview was just published in Vogue Philippines recently, she talked about how kapwa is almost a spiritual thing. But she was very tentative about talking about it because there's, as she says in the article, also in her interview, it's that people have suspicion of including animism in psychology. Of course, there's still that tentativeness, that
Sure, there's
suspicion.
in academia, there's this tendency to try and create this strict separation,
Right, yeah.
between what we might call the spiritual beliefs and the kind of materialist beliefs, I think they tend to
Yeah.
call it.
Mm.
That separation blurs, in your view, because this becomes part of a personal belief system.
This goes into more mystical studies, more mystical readings, especially with ancient Eastern traditions. And a lot of Eastern traditions that have been westernized, that have kind of been popularized in the West by folks like Alan Watts, Thomas Cleary, these people during that time, really do express a kind of unity with the world in the sense that it's not a classification, but more like a contrast. Not because as we see it today, especially in the way that we use language, especially in the way that we describe things, even in the scientific worldview, we tend to classify things into separate and unique events and unique things. But when it comes to identity, when it comes to personality, it's not a classification, but a contrast of you and the field that you're in or the world that you're in. So figure and field, yin and yang, these are part of the same whole. So the way that I see it also is that your personality is shaped by and shaped through your interaction with kapwa. And a lot of philosophers and scholars and indigenous researchers would probably also say the same, in that the interiority of a person, what we call loob, and loob is an interesting term because it appears so frequently in our language to describe behaviors that reflect an inner self. So loob really just means the inside of something. So if we ask what's the inside of a box, ano nasa loob ng kahon, that's just the inside of the box. But when it's the inside of the person, described in multiple different words, so there's a long list of words that have the word loob in them, describing moral acts, ethical acts, behaviors that are pro-social or anti-social. So the inner self is expressed through its interaction with the world. And it's this contrast, you see, that creates personality as we understand it.
And I mean, for the audience who listen to this is quite different from the traditional, you could say, Western philosophical or Western psychological perspective, which is typically more based on the individual as kind of the king of their own domain,
Right.
very much focused on personal experience. I think, therefore, I am kind of idea of the world.
Solipsistic almost, yeah.
Yeah, and less focused on this connection to community or something bigger than the self.
Yeah.
Other than, in some cases, God, of course, being part of that.
Mm.
But there does seem to have been a trend, particularly in the last 20, 30 years, to double down on a lot of that, on individualism, on consumerism, on the kind of self-centeredness that often comes about in the big Western countries. So I'm interested in what you think about that, if you think that has influenced Filipino culture, or do you think that there are aspects of Filipino culture that almost, because of its nature, resist some of that trend?
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, firstly, I think that it's really ironic. Yeah, it's very strange because there was already a lot of development in the Western world to challenge its solipsistic worldview. Transpersonal psychology was one of them, even humanistic psychology before that. Even in the field of medicine, you've got the biopsychosocial perspective, right, within psychiatry, and movements that challenge just the individual body pathology of the way that we think of the human experience. There were already, even Gestalt psychology, which emerged from Europe, was already looking at the whole, the human being as part of the world. And even in existential psychology, we see theorists and scholars looking into the meaning making of a person in the world, in their experience. But then, yeah, it is very strange that somehow that way of thinking has been slowly reduced. Today we see how especially technology is creating, it's very ironic that technology that connects us, it's connecting us right now, people from vast distances, is still a thing that polarizes us, a thing that separates us, creates unique and individual niches. What I find interesting is that I was just watching this TED Talk with this linguist, and he was talking about how, algo speak, the language of people encouraged by algorithms. So you've got a lot of what we call brain rot terms, or whatever people call it these days. These create niches, People have individualized identities because of certain algorithms, of pages that are dedicated towards their individual desires, so that larger companies can sell them stuff, so that it's easier to, okay, so maybe you're into this kind of thing called cottagecore or mid-century modern, and now we'll sell you furniture and clothes that fit this aesthetic, even though you're not living out the lifestyle in the real world. Used to be that these things emerged from a lifestyle. It was, so to speak, indigenous to certain lifestyles. But, it becomes so individualized, so specific, because this is how people can use us and can sell stuff to us. When it comes to answer your question about whether Filipino culture can resist this, statistics have over and over again shown that Filipinos are one of the top users of social media, one of the top users of web-based applications, mainly to connect with people. So there's still that social behavior that comes from this traditional way of interacting with people that transcends to the digital space. But that doesn't mean that we're immune somehow to globalization, that we're immune somehow to Western influence or individualist influence. I wouldn't say that there are individualist and collectivist cultures. This is another one of those easy generalizations that social scientists have been doing for the longest time, that somehow Filipino culture is collectivist versus, let's say, for example, North American culture is strictly individualist. This isn't exactly true. We know that cultures have within them individualists and collectivists at the same time. In our culture, it just so happens that it's more enforced. I mean, the collectivist kinship-based systems are more enforced because of the smaller communities. Uh, but at the same time, there are concepts such as makasarili, which is like an advocate of the self. Uh, a lot of selfishness, but it's framed in such a way that it's a choice to not catch another person. So there's a term that we use. We say saluhan, which is to catch other people. So for example, if I get in trouble at work and I have a friend, they'll say sagot na kita, I'll answer for you, and then they would catch whatever I missed, and they would speak up for me or they would protect me. The opposite to that is what we call laglagan. So if saluhan is to catch, laglagan is to drop. So it's like throwing someone under the bus. It's snitching
Right.
on them, essentially.
Sure.
So it's a frowned upon behavior. Wag mo akong laglagin, o nilalaglag mo ko. Don't drop me. It's a frowned upon behavior. So I think these are some of those subtle nuances that do happen. I don't know if it's directly influenced by globalization, but
These
most likely.
these are what you would call kind of the cultural and social norms of the country and the people. And you talk a lot about the language itself, and I also wonder if you see some differences between Tagalog and English, whether you see certain ways of speaking or addressing things that are different. I know, for instance, from my very limited knowledge, I know, for instance, that in Tagalog it's very easy to form groups with people you've just met in a way that's hard in English. In English, we might say, I have a roommate or I have a classmate, but that kind of pairing seems to be much more prevalent in the Philippines, of establishing groups, creating identity around groups seems to be prevalent in a way that's not as prevalent in English. If I'm not wrong, this is my impression.
Right. We're just talking about language here, right? But if language is something that emerges from interactions with culture, in other words, like we only give words to things that are important to us, right?
Right.
So yeah, definitely, maybe there is something there. That's why a linguistic approach is usually preferred when it comes to indigenous psychology, because that's where a lot of our psychologies are embedded, like in the language itself. I have noticed that comparing Filipino and English is that English is more clinical in a lot of in the way that it uses, very sterile, right? It separates words from each other. There's a subject, there's an object. So the way that you would write a sentence is very linear. The way that you would there's something causing something else. So there's a direct relationship in the sense of one causes the other. It's linear. It goes one way. But in Filipino language, there's a lot of it's heavy in context. The infixes are ridiculous. You can place it anywhere, and it would change the meaning of the word in a very, very subtle way. For example, the concept of hiya, which is usually just translated as shame or timidity. If you add different infixes or affixes, whatever it is, before, in the middle, at the end, and you change it in different ways, it's a different kind of nuanced shame. It's not just shame as in I'm ashamed of myself, but it's embarrassment in front of an authority figure. It's disowning other people. It's being accidentally embarrassed. It's so many different ways, but it's still hiya. That's the root there. And you're right. There's a lot of ways we can talk that is very nuanced, that is heavy in context and deep in context. So yeah, it's the language itself. But it's not just Tagalog. I mean, you look at other languages across the country, Bisaya, you've got Ilocano, you've got 100 other Filipino languages that also have their own unique psychology. And it's very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. English is often criticized in this way for being a little bit vague in its words. I know, we typically have one word for love and friendship, which is not true in a lot of other languages.
Mhm.
And that maybe that does have some impact on us. But yeah, I'm curious about this, whether you see the language comes first or the culture comes first, or it's a bit of both in terms of
Mhm.
how it emerges, because
Yeah.
it could
Uh,
just be reflecting our practices.
right. Yeah, it's definitely interesting. It's interesting that you did mention love and friendship because so let me just this might be a little linguistically dense, but the word for love here is mahal, which is to love, just mahal. But mahal is also the same word we use for something that's expensive. In other words, something that's valuable. So mahal could mean both love and value. We say mahal kita, I love you, but the word kita is a word that you find across the country, across the archipelago, and kita means us. So it's not I love you as in there's a direction there, or you love me as a direction there, but mahal kita is I love us. So that's just an interesting thing, because the opposite of mahal as an expensive object is mura, which is a cheap object. So something inexpensive or without value is called mura. But also, if I say bad words against you, if I call you a slur, it's also called mura. So that action of me calling you a slur is mura. I devalue you. So that's an interesting thing, how mahal and mura and mahal kita connect. But when you say friendship, now another word for to love is pag-ibig, which is to love. Pag is a prefix that implies to do something. So ibig is an interesting thing because it's not just love, it's sincerity. So ibig, you also say it in ibig sabihin, meaning this is what I mean. Ibig, my desire to tell you something. And you see this also in the word for friend, which is kaibigan. So ibig is in the middle. The ka in the front is almost like a co. In English, it would be co, so like co-teacher, co-parent, co-whatever. So ka, ibig, an. And the last suffix an implies a shared activity. So inuman is inom, to drink together, inuman. Laruan is something that you play with. Laro is to play. An is an activity. And then you've got a lot of other words that have an an at the end. So ka-ibig-an is the shared activity of being sincere, a shared sincerity. So you see a lot of these very specific nuances and very playful language, I see. It's a lot of context and playfulness. So
Right, right.
even the ka prefix is present in a lot of ways, because if we're part of the same organization, I would add a ka before your name to kind of imply that you're of the same cause. So ka
Yeah,
Joshua,
I
I
think
call you.
this is what I meant in terms of the group formation. This is
Mm,
one way of creating groups very informally, very quickly,
yeah.
um, in a way which is quite hard in English in some sense. Usually you'd have to come up with a name for your group or organization, which seems a bit more laborious than just adding a prefix to whatever the place is or something. Um, but I'm interested in this as well, in the sense that when you're talking about value and placing value on 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 someone, there seems to be a trend at the moment, at least in the Western countries,
Mm,
towards a kind of commercialization of relationships. Uh, you can see that with dating apps on the one hand, but you can also see it in how people treat each other, which is sometimes more like a trading relationship. You give me something and I'll give you something, which is very different from traditional conceptions of love and friendship and connection with people. And I wonder how you see this shift, or if you see this shift.
mm. Yeah, in a lot of ways, this is what we call the transactional relationship is what we call kaliwaan. which is kaliwa is left, so left hand technically. So it's just I give you with my right hand, you give it to my left hand, so it's kaliwaan. So usually when you do a project, for example, and you're required to be present for one day, after that day, o kaliwaan, you just pay me for that day. So I'm present here, I do this thing, and then you give me this money. So that's a transactional relationship. I do see it in the way that we treat romance. You're right, love has become gamified. It becomes like, oh, this is interesting. It's on your phone, and it really removes a lot of nuance. Now, if you feel like you're just talking to something on your phone, doesn't feel human in a lot of ways. That's why there still is something very, very profound when it comes to interacting with people in person. You get to feel with them. And a huge part of our values is about feeling with other people. And going back to my interest in the paranormal, this is what I find. It isn't really paranormal in the sense of, oh, it's bizarre and strange. It really is just an extension of our empathy for people. So I feel something strange, like with others, and this is really just what people might call ESP or premonitions or telepathy, but it's really just me empathizing with others, and we call this pakikiramdam, to feel with other people. So it's different when you're in person, and it's definitely different when you're just staring at a phone, even though we can also sense there's these are things that are difficult to describe, right? But there are a lot of behaviors and things that are already memified and expressed in jokes and all that. But there is a way that we can kind of sense whenever someone's being cold in chat, for example, when someone's not acting the way that they do. We have a very intuitive sense of what we call tampo, which is not just sulking, but it's a kind of sulking, it's a kind of disappointment, but it really is a kind of nonverbal communication of telling others, hey, I'm feeling a certain way because of something you did to me. Can you kind of reach out to me? We can sense that over the phone, which is an interesting thing also. I genuinely lost your question. What was it? I don't know if I answered it.
No, I think you did answer it. I think you did answer it. I think that, I mean, it's very interesting because it's obviously a very online culture, and it's a very intensely social, a strong social media presence, and strong links on the internet. But there seems to be, obviously the internet is a very fragmented place at the moment. There's a lot of anger on social media. There's a lot of division. How do you see that playing out in the culture, and are you worried about those elements?
In terms of divisiveness, this is something that we've seen on a more practical scale when it came to the recent elections, which was 2 years ago. 3 years ago. During that time, there was a lot of divisiveness on social media. But it came about because people were not seeing, or people were not practicing kapwa. People were not practicing that sense of shared identity. There was a sense somehow that a certain group we're just better than you. And so creating this distance, creating this distinction has become kind of a norm in terms of propaganda, which is a very weird thing, because this is something I find extremely profound and interesting when it comes to political propaganda, is that in the recent elections, the current president used the slogan unity. And unity is a very interesting thing, because unity is in Filipino, it's pakikiisa, it's coming together as one. So they were playing with, I don't know, intentionally or unintentionally, whatever it is, but they were playing with Filipino psychological concepts like folk psychology. Back in the 70s, it was already identified that the deepest level of kapwa is pakikiisa, which is unity, oneness with each other. So using it in this way as a form of kind of subtly calling for kapwa, but in a political way, is an interesting thing to see. So it can be weaponized. It can be used in a lot of different ways. But there was a lot of divisiveness when it came to online discourse. It's an interesting term that we apply to online discussions. Discourse, like, makes it serious and heavy, but really it's just people sharing their opinions. So
Yeah,
that,
I mean, certainly, and that seems to be playing out everywhere. This kind of
yeah,
sense of division or putting people against each other, but then also, as you say, the psychological dimensions of political messaging is very interesting in that sense. The the uh, tendency. I wanted to dig more into this idea of the what you're calling the folk psychology and these ideas. Where do they come from, and how do you see their development in terms of colonialism and what happened in the Philippines? For those who don't know, who are listening, the Philippines was under a succession of colonial governments, the Spanish, the Americans for a bit as well. The Japanese during World War II occupied the country. There is this sense of fragmentation of the culture from colonialism, and a lot of your work tries to dig into that, about not necessarily going back to a time before, but trying to integrate all of this history together and trying to understand the culture from that, if I'm not mistaking you.
So the idea of having to go back to a time before colonialism very subtly implies a linear perspective of culture, in the sense that it actually does encourage the same kind of logic that colonial thinkers use in describing what is civilized and what is primitive, as if it's on a spectrum of human development, that in the social evolution of people, there are people supposedly more primitive and supposedly more civilized. And this was, civilization used to be, or even until now, I suppose, more of a Eurocentric or ethnocentric thing, very specific to certain cultures, European, North American, and so on. And that used to be the standard of civilization. And the thing is, to say that we have to go back to the past implies the same kind of thing, that somehow there was a more of a purer thing. It implies a hierarchy of what is more, what is better, and so on. But I follow the train of thought of thinkers such as Nick Joaquin, was a national artist for literature, wrote a fantastic. He's a fiction writer, but he wrote a lot about history. And he wrote this book called Culture and History back in the 80s, where he already tried to answer this same question. It's not that we lost culture. We gained culture, and we continue to develop culture despite our interaction with colonizers. And what he pointed out was that it's so strange that we write our history all the time from the point of view of the colonizer, or the standard is always like, there was a colonizer, this and that. How come, he said, in other cultures where they were also invaded by foreign nations, they were also subjugated by foreign oppressors, but their history books would write about the development of technology during that time, not necessarily, kind of minimizing, setting aside the invaders, setting aside the colonizers, even though it was an important time. But what was more important to these cultures is that in their history, they absorbed, assimilated technology, ways of cooking, for example, language, spirituality, which is the same thing that happened to us. And yet there's a lot of this fear and worry and regret and a lot of I'd say misplaced nostalgia for a time before all this, which ironically was recorded by European chroniclers. So our standard for the past has always been like, oh, European. But even thinkers like Virgilio Enriquez, who is the pioneer of Filipino indigenous psychology, said that, just because a lot of things were destroyed, and this is very true, a lot of manuscripts were destroyed, a lot of relics were destroyed, that does not equate to the destruction of culture, because we're still here and the culture still persists. So what we study in terms of culture, in terms of indigeneity, is what is today. Um, who we are today, even our longing for the past, is shaped by this history, is shaped by this interaction with foreign technology, with foreign powers, with oppression and subversion and subjugation and revolution and wars and so on. This is part of who we are as people. So it's kind of like, and I see this on a more individual sense, it's really a almost a therapeutic journey of an individual as they try to let go of childhood nostalgia. You know, that nostalgia we have for better times in our childhood. This is the same kind of nostalgia that we have when we want to regress into the past. So in therapy, for you to interact with the world today, and the world today has a lot of problems. The world today has a lot of divisiveness. The world today has a lot of wonder and love and hope. So in order to get back to the grounding of today, we kind of have to, and it's the same thing with therapy, we kind of have to deal with the traumas of the past, face them properly, and actually give that space to talk about it, and then look at what's happening today instead of projecting into things, into the past, or escaping into some kind of essentialized or romanticized or exoticized version of who we're supposed to be.
Yeah, I think that makes sense to me, and I think the idea of a kind of cultural purity obviously is problematic sometimes
Yeah,
to talk about, because culture always evolves even without
right.
necessarily invasion and these things. It will change over time, and my understanding is that a lot was lost, and so it
Yeah,
is difficult to return to a time if the histories and things aren't necessarily fully there as well.
yeah.
There's a sort of practical element to this.
But yeah, just to add to that, I would argue that a lot of things still do exist today. And that's what I find really interesting, because if we do trace the roots of practices today, and this is something that can be found specifically, for example, in religion. So in folk religion and spirituality, a lot of people would say, oh, Catholicism and Christianity destroyed folk belief and folk religion. And there's this clear demarcation of like when it was destroyed, which is the colonial era. But if you actually look at the folk religion today, even though they use Catholic or Christian imagery, the underlying current is very animist. So scholars, even from the 90s, from back in the past, they would say that it's not actually folk Christianity or folk Catholicism, it's Christianized animism. It's still the same folk belief, but it's just dressed up in a different thing.
Yeah,
Um,
I think we see this a lot with pagan traditions, even in Europe, that are now
yeah,
integrated into Christianity.
exactly.
There's certain ideas around the harvest time and spring and autumn and things like this
Yeah.
that have become part of
Christmas and
Christian.
Valentine's and
Yeah,
all these
yeah.
things. Yeah.
I think a part of the
Easter.
Easter traditions
Yeah,
are also kind of going back to spring pagan traditions as well,
exactly. Yeah,
not
yeah,
purely Christian traditions.
yeah.
Um, yeah, so that's very interesting. I'm aware that we're coming to the end of your time potentially. So I wanted to ask if there's anything that we haven't covered that you wanted to bring up or chat about.
Yeah. Well, actually, I'm more interested in your interest on this topic.
Right. Yeah.
So yeah, you did reach out to me online. Can you tell me more about like what you're looking for essentially, or
Yeah. So I
yeah,
mean, I just am really interested in some of the topics that you delve into. I think some of the things we talked about in terms of community, individualism, and the group, and these different topics that are a big part of the discussion today, I mean, my background is more on a personal level in philosophy and reading a lot about philosophy and how that has changed over time from this very individualistic ideal at one point to the modern idea, which is a bit more of an integration of Eastern philosophy with Western philosophy and the kind of merging of the traditions. So that's kind of where my interest comes from in these topics about how these things have changed over time and how we can have a more mature view of what the individual is in society and how the two relate to each other and how the collective is formed as well. I think that these are all really interesting topics. I also think they're topics that people are really struggling with trying to understand. Yeah, that's why I think it's an interesting conversation.
Yeah, finding yourself in the world. Yeah, so it's always a difficult thing. But then when we start to look into a lot of these Eastern religions or Eastern beliefs, philosophies, we see that the self or the ego, which I'm sure you know is variously defined depending on who says it, really is just an interaction with the world. So that's where I'm coming from also when it comes to discussion of culture, is that whatever we call culture is just emerging from our interactions with people. It's not like an atom of purity of some kind of thing. That's something that I find really bizarre. There's some kind of atomistic belief when it comes to culture, that there's like what we discussed, like a pure culture, that if you don't have it, you're not it. So
yeah.
So there's
I mean, I think we struggle with that because I think there's this idea of rituals on the one hand, which are defined and there's an order to them and a structure to them, and they're part of culture, but they're not the entirety of culture. And even the rituals themselves tend to change over time. So you might have, Easter and Christmas were different 100 years ago than today. The entire image has changed, the aesthetic has changed, but also some of the interactions and the sort of daily traditions have changed.
But we still have the rabbit and we still have the tree.
Yeah. So there are things that say the same as well. But I think I get your point that it's not about holding on to that pure original idea necessarily. It's about celebrating what we have and what we've made. Yeah.
And also, really, if this is the hopeful thing about it, it's that we know that a lot of things continue to persist today in terms of colonial systems, in terms of colonized aesthetics or intellectual, especially in the academe. There's a lot of intellectual dominance there. There's certain worldviews are prioritized or privileged. So what's hopeful here is that an awareness of our context and our history and our more intuitive aspects can tell us with more clarity that a lot of these things aren't really effective. They're not really useful to us. And a huge part of it is to challenge these notions. I love the idea of what we call desire paths. Desire paths, right? So there's like two concrete roads that intersect in a kind of a perpendicular way. People would create a path that goes diagonally, right? To just kind of shorten the distance. That's a desire path. And that's an intuitive way. Despite the concrete roads, there's still this intuition that makes it easier. And yet we enforce concrete on our ways of thinking. We enforce order and that this is the way that we think, which is in large part a heritage of colonialism, of these neo-colonial thoughts that continue to exist today. And one very clear example of this is that local fashion still considers wearing layered clothing as a standard for good fashion. And this is in this tropical country where 30-degree weather Celsius
it's
really
an impractical.
It's very hot, and yet I see in the noontime sun of this tropical archipelago people wearing like fur coat or like leather jackets. We just say, we have a term for it actually, we say tiis ganda. tolerating for beauty. So it's just a very that's an example of like a colonial influence. Because if you wear, these jackets in a colder country where they came from anyway, it makes sense. It's intuitive. It's indigenous to that place. But that's an example. It's a very basic example of like how challenging what's intuitive, what's convenient, what's inconvenient can help us go decolonize, essentially. Again, a clunky academic term, but just going back to intuitive things, authenticity.
The only thing left is to thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Josh.